Thank you all very much for inviting me here. I'm excited to talk with you about my book, and we'll just get started. Oh, I do need my glasses. My research on Missouri German abolitionists dates back to the summer of 2015, when I became interested in organizing an exhibition on the topic. My husband and I had taken a weekend trip to Herman, the small town located in the Missouri River Valley, as you all know, that was established by Germans as part of the Philadelphia Settlement Society in 1838. In the gift shop of the Historical Museum, located in the German school that was built in 1871, I began thumbing through a paperback illustrated history of Herman. There was a lot written about the wineries created by the industrious immigrants, their innovative farming and gardening techniques, and striking photographs of the picturesque town and its historic buildings. I then came upon a brief paragraph about Herman being a hotbed of anti-slavery activity, and that early German immigrants who settled there had published newspapers that spoke out against slavery. The vocal anti-slavery perspective, while commonplace in the northern states during the 1840s, was quite radical in rural Missouri, as Missouri had come into the Union in 1821 as a slave state, and many of the Anglo-American landowners in the fertile Missouri River Valley owned slaves. And you can see here with this table how dense the slave population was along the Missouri River. The little tiny squares are 100 slaves. So, a bar, if you can see here on the left side, hold on a second if I can find that, yeah. That's 1,000 slaves. So there were quite a few along here, thousands. As a Missouri transplant, born in Oklahoma and raised in New York City, I was not at the time well acquainted with Missouri history. But as I began researching the topic, it soon became clear that the activism of anti-slavery German immigrants in Missouri, as well as their courageous service in volunteer Union regiments at the start of the Civil War, was pivotal for both Missouri, a state that was being governed by the closet secessionist Claiborne Jackson, as well as for the country at large. My exhibition, Fighting for a Free Missouri, showed at St. Louis University's Center for Global Citizenship on Lincoln's birthday in 2016, and traveled to Herman's Deutsheim State Historic Site, where it was exhibited in one of the historic German houses. Sociologist and playwright Cecilia Nadal came across the exhibition catalog and was inspired by it. She began conducting her own research on the historical and current relationships between African Americans and Germans, the two largest ethnic groups in Missouri. She organized interdisciplinary symposia in which scholars of African American history and of German American history came together to discuss their relationships and shared histories. She continues to facilitate group discussions in both rural towns and big cities, where Missouri residents, both black and white, share their stories. And this is Cecilia, and this is a group discussion in Herman, Missouri that took place in 2019. These discussions have been groundbreaking in helping us to better understand the contributions of the German Americans, not just within the academic discipline of German American studies, but within the broader context of their relationships with African Americans. We are learning how the contributions of some Missouri Germans informed the actual material lives of African Americans, both free and enslaved, and how these immigrants have helped to make Missouri a more humane and livable place. An important outcome of our collaborative work is the publication of the anthology that I have come to speak about today. Questions that the book and this presentation explore and attempt to answer are: did Germans work closely with Missouri Blacks toward the common goal of ending slavery, or did they fight valiantly for the cause yet remain separate from the people for whose rights they were fighting? To what extent did anti-slavery Germans stay true to their Republican democratic values in their personal lives? Were the Germans who fought for emancipation of like mind in other questions of social justice? Did they also support African American suffrage, voting rights for women, equal access to education? When examining the German anti-slavery movement in Missouri, it is helpful to know that African Americans have been present in the territory since long before statehood, long before Germans settled in the region, even long before there was a United States. We learn from John Wright, one of the leading scholars of Missouri African American history, who together with his son, John Wright Jr., contributed an informative piece on Missouri African Americans to the volume, that the earliest Black inhabitants were enslaved and came to the region with French settlers. The laws concerning French slavery in Missouri were outlined in Code Noir, or Black Code, and were first issued by King Louis XIV of France in 1685. This is a later edition of 1744. Code Noir stated that enslaved people had a right to own property. They were allowed to work for themselves on feast days and holidays, and the money they earned could be saved and eventually be used to buy their own freedom. The enslaved also had access to courts to settle disputes. A slave's testimony could be admissible in courts as evidence. It was illegal to separate enslaved families through a sale, and a request from an enslaved person to purchase his or her own freedom could not be denied. But soon after the transfer of French territories to the United States in 1803, as Anglo-American anxieties about the possibility of slave revolts increased, much more stringent policies regarding the legal rights of the enslaved and of free Blacks began to take effect, eventually eradicating the protective laws that the people of color from colonial times had counted on. It was during this time that the two waves of German settlers arrived. Most of the German abolitionists in Missouri were 48ers, young and idealistic revolutionaries from the German states who fought successfully for freedom from Napoleonic rule and later against the despotism of the German princes. Germany was not a unified country until 1871, but rather a loose confederation of states ruled by local princes. During this time, the great majority of Germans were oppressed on many levels. They could not vote, could not speak openly about their views on politics or social questions, paid exorbitant taxes to the princes and got little in return, could not own land, the majority of them could not own land, as most of the land belonged to the aristocracy. In 1848, uprisings against the nobility and in favor of a republic spread across the German states as well as other countries in Europe. And as you can see, in all of the major cities, there were uprisings. And the pink area, the pink outline, is the Confederation of States, of German states. And here you have a flag, an early flag of the revolutionaries, even though they despised the French. They despised the French because they had occupied their territory. They were also inspired by the French Revolution. So you see up here the famous slogan, liberté, égalité, fraternité ou la mort, or death. And here, Freiheit, let me see, can I see it from here? Brüderkeit, and can somebody tell me what the center is? I have to look closer just a second. Gleichheit, yeah, Gleichheit, which is equality. So that's an early flag, and later on, the 48ers used the flag that you see in the drawing, and interestingly, this was news to me when I was researching, that modern day Germany uses the same flag, and the black represents the condition of the enslaved, be it in Germany at the time or elsewhere. Blood, the red represents the blood that will be spent in fighting for justice, and gold is when justice reigns. So it's really unbelievable that the modern country of Germany is using that 48ers flag. Okay, so of course these rebellions were brutally put down, and the 48ers, as they were called, were either killed, sentenced to life imprisonment, or forced into exile. I actually read the other day that the authorities paid some of them to come to the United States just to get rid of them. And here you see a caricature by Ferdinand Schröder. You see the aristocrats, the pillars of society, the members of the church, the military, and they all have their brooms, and they're basically just sweeping them out of the way to get them out of the country. These 48ers were most of them were highly educated and outspoken, and their ideals developed out of a rich tradition of political theory, debate, and activism. Many of them, as well as some of their predecessors who had arrived in Missouri in the 1830s, and I'll be talking about a couple of them, were most attracted to the United States because it had, against the odds, won the War of Independence against the English monarch. They venerated the American Constitution and took it seriously, and many were distraught by the fact that slavery was a legal and accepted practice in Missouri. Two important early figures in Missouri's anti-slavery movement were Carl Straley and his brother-in-law, Edvard Mühl, who settled in Herman, as I mentioned before, in 1838 with the Philadelphia Settlement Society. They moved, actually, they were from Cincinnati, but a lot of the people who moved with them wanted to preserve their German customs and language because they were already kind of assimilating into American society. So they actually created in Philadelphia they used the plan of Philadelphia for Herman because they expected it to be a major metropolis. It never actually happened. But the inner core is basically the plan of the urban planning of Philadelphia. Okay, so these two men became editors of the Hamano Wochenblatt and wrote frequently against slavery as early as the 1840s. Mühl wrote, "We hold ourselves as free men who did not escape slavery in our old homelands to support it here in America." He also wrote against the 1850 fugitive slave laws, the law requiring that all fugitive slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had escaped to a free state. He described the law as, quote, "the disgraceful shame to our Union," stating slavery is nothing other in our republic but the representation of the privileged aristocracy and tyranny comparable to the actions of the princes in Germany. Mühl also reported slave sales, the separation of families, lynchings, and beatings, and in 1853, he began a serialized publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's abolitionist novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, as a front-page feature that ran for 26 weeks. And probably a lot of you have been, some of the people I speak for don't know where Harmon is, but maybe you've been to the Straley house. In the basement is the printing press for the two newspapers that they worked on. And on the right-hand side, you see Ed Mahmoud's type box, which was brought from Cincinnati to 1943. It's really worth a trip if you haven't been there. So, another prominent gray, and the grays were the older generation of German immigrants, was the distinguished Friedrich Münch, a Lutheran pastor and theologian who in Missouri became a skilled farmer, vintner, and politician. He and his family came to the United States with the Gießen Immigration Society and settled on a farm in Dutzau in Warren County, also located in the Missouri River Valley. Münch wrote prolifically on diverse topics ranging from religion and rationalism to farming and politics. His prolific pieces on abolition are both nuanced and persuasive, and he was celebrated locally, nationally, and abroad in German-language newspapers in Philadelphia, New York, Cincinnati, and Germany. Münch's gift for polemics is apparent in an opinion piece published January 29, 1862 in St. Louis's Anzeiger des Westens, in which he argues that it is the course of the Enlightenment to transform society that will ultimately end slavery. He writes, "Is the slavery question really insoluble? Must the growth of enlightenment, which has changed and improved everything and overcome one after another of the perverted institutions of humanity, cease its work at the institution of black slavery and leave it forever untouched? We assume at the outset that every maladjustment arising from human error is capable of a human solution, however difficult it might be. To declare the failing to be beyond recovery is moral cowardice, and often nothing more than mean and hypocritical self-indulgence." Münch campaigned with the German revolutionary Friedrich Hecker and was elected to Missouri's legislature, where he served during the American Civil War. His youngest son, Berthold, was among the first volunteers in the Civil War and died at the age of 17 in the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Münch was among the few Republicans who, during the years of Reconstruction, continued to work for legislation that would ensure political and social equality for African Americans. He concentrated largely on securing voting rights for blacks, convincing a large majority of his neighbors in the Missouri River Valley to vote yes on the Black Suffrage Amendment of 1868. It is clear from voting records that his district in Warren County was the only one that voted overwhelmingly in favor of black suffrage. Neighboring areas voted against it. And as we know, African American men in Missouri did not receive the vote until 1870, and women, both black and white, were excluded from voting until 1920. Despite the honorable actions of some of the earlier German immigrants, a few of the more prosperous ones, including Münch, adapted to the ways of the landowning gentry and succumbed to purchasing slaves. The United States slave schedule for 1850 in Warren County shows, for example, that a young enslaved woman was living on his property. At the same time, Münch's eldest daughter, 21-year-old Paulina, left home to marry Gordian Bush, a horse breeder and vintner from the area. The slave schedule shows that Bush had also purchased a slave for his new household. Paulina expresses her ethical quandary regarding slave ownership in a letter to her aunt in Germany. It has been 2 years now since my husband bought a Negro maid of 13 years for $820. Because you can't get any help here. I was reluctant for so long as I can't stand the thought that I would own a slave, because I have always been disgusted by this trade. Yet what can you do when you live in a country where such a thing is allowed and you can't help yourself in any other way? One such a creature of good deed, if one does as we have, buying her from a hardened sir and then treated humanely, as good as our own child, she has regular meals and clothing, is handled benevolently, and of course her freedom is absent, but in its stead she has not worries. Paulina's words shed light on the ethical predicament of what Missouri Germans who were accustomed to servants in Europe experienced as pioneers in a sparsely inhabited state, in which there were few wage laborers available, but ample opportunities to purchase slaves. While the choices they made are, from our contemporary perspective, unjustifiable and hypocritical, there is evidence that it was easier for the Greys, this earlier generation, to adapt to the social mores of the landowning gentry. Noteworthy, however, is that none of the Herman settlers, who also belonged to the early wave of immigrants, owned slaves. The 48ers, who arrived between 12 and 15 years later, were repelled by slave ownership, both in theory and practice. The prominent revolutionary Friedrich Hecker, for example, rejected the slave state of Missouri altogether as a possible residence, purchasing instead a farm in the neighboring free state of Illinois. Most of the 48ers, aside from a small number of Latin farmers, and many of you probably know the Latin farmers were highly educated people who knew Latin, basically, who idealized the farming life, so they decided to try to be farmers, many with not much success, but some did have some. So aside from this small number of Latin farmers, they settled in St. Louis, as the city possessed greater opportunities for employment and a well-established immigrant social network. At their time of arrival, the city was in a state of monumental flux in terms of both commerce and social relations. It had surged in population due to the vast number of Germans and Irish pouring in, and it had also attracted both northern and southern settlers who were ideologically, if not yet socially, at odds with one another. They did socialize with each other. St. Louis's growing prosperity as a manufacturing port city gave rise to new visions of social progress. This dynamism is captured in 19th century drawings of the city. A lot of these ended up being published in journals abroad, especially this one, Illustrated London News. And so people in Europe who wanted to immigrate would see this burgeoning town, and want to come. But rapid growth and increased cultural diversity gave rise to new anxieties regarding disorder and decay. And St. Louis became a center of antagonism between northern and southern perspectives. For the South, St. Louis became a place to which the eastern centers of colonial slavery could send surplus labor, and thereby increase the monetary value of enslaved people. Northerners, on the other hand, were drawn to the idea of territorial and economic expansion. Farmers and artisans, mostly anti-slavery, moved west from New England, New York, and Pennsylvania to take advantage of the economic growth. As a result, the political situation of Missouri which, as we know, was a border state, became increasingly inflammatory. Social volatility had shown itself as early as 1836 with a brutal and publicly endorsed lynching of a free boatman of mixed race, Francis L. McIntosh, and the related killing of the anti-slavery newspaper editor Elijah Lovejoy in nearby Alton, Illinois, 1837. 14 years later, the Dred Scott case, in which the enslaved person Dred Scott sued for his freedom, won it, and then lost it in an appeal, made national headlines. And all of these political acts and violent episodes outraged opponents of slavery across the country. While many argued that slave life in Missouri was more benevolent than on the southern plantations, and it probably was because it was, as we know, a soft form of slavery, rather than these, plantations with hundreds and hundreds of slaves. Nevertheless, the former Missouri enslaved William Wells Brown thought otherwise. Brown, who had witnessed his own mother being beaten in the fields, escaped to Cleveland and later moved to Buffalo, where he became an active abolitionist. In his autobiography, he describes the barbarity of Missouri slavery. Slavery is thought by some to be mild in Missouri when compared with the cotton, sugar, and rice-growing states, yet no part of our slaveholding country is more noted for the barbarity of its inhabitants than St. Louis. Political maneuvers on the federal level also exacerbated the situation. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had prohibited slavery north of Missouri's southern border, which you can see on this side. But in 1854, the compromise was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers in the new Western territories to decide for themselves whether slavery was permissible up here. This repeal was a blow to anti-slavery groups across the country. The famous abolitionist writer and orator Frederick Douglass recognized that the act clearly hindered the progress of abolition. Fellow citizens, he wrote for a speech on October 30th, 1854. The proposition to repeal the Missouri Compromise was a stunning one. It fell across the nation like a bolt from a cloudless sky. The thing was too stunning for belief, and you knew that the repeal of the Missouri Compromise was a breach of honor. The German press in St. Louis also expressed outrage that President Pierce and his administration would reverse legislation designed to limit slavery's expansion in order to support a small minority of powerful slaveholders. "We are on the eve of civil war," reported the Anzeiger. "This is the fruits of the Nebraska bill, that curse-worthy measure that a hunter for a conscienceless presidency has concocted, a miserable administration has pushed through, and one that we are supposed to recognize as holy and unalterable, simply because it was written into the statute books, albeit through lying and fraud." It was amidst this political and social turmoil centered about the question of slavery that the 48ers arrived in St. Louis. Despite the city's growing number of northern and immigrant voices opposed to slavery, St. Louis was still the largest slave market in the state. Enslaved people were sold on the eastern steps of the city's courthouse, and not far away were the, quote, slave pens, where the enslaved were shackled and held overnight before transit. German immigrants living in the city were witnesses to this, yet they also encountered African Americans in other capacities. Members of both groups worked as laborers at the river ports, as you can see here. This was 1840. African Americans sometimes rented rooms from Germans Germans and also patronized their shops. The St. Louis Turner Association, a society of German immigrant gymnasts who were mostly Republican, at least here in the United States. They had extremely conservative Turners over in Austria and Germany, and they're still over there. But here, they were Republican. They rented their downtown hall to African Americans for special meetings and balls. And when the drive for black suffrage began in 1864, Central Turner Hall hosted speeches by important civil rights leaders. John Langston, the president of the National Equal Rights League, as well as Frederick Douglass, spoke at Turner Hall. But opinions within the sizable German immigrant anti-slavery camp were diverse. One can get an idea of the variety of political perspectives by examining the contrasting beliefs and actions of the 48er Henry Bornstein, at one time Heinrich Bernstein, probably. He was the prominent publisher of Anzeiger des Westens and those of his son, Augustus Sigismund. Henry, or Heinrich, was born in Hamburg and raised in Lemberg, Austria, which is actually Austrian-occupied Poland. He was a man of many talents: political activist, author, soldier, actor, and stage manager. He served in the Austrian army and ultimately resigned and became involved in journalism and theater. This is his young wife, Maria Seltzer. He married her when she was 15, which caused, a big rumpus. And this is him, obviously, when he was a young man in Vienna. He moved to Paris, and as a young man in Paris, he made a name for himself in journalism as the publisher of Fervent, a culture and political magazine for German-speaking émigrés. Republican, it was early, 1840s, right before the uprisings. After the failed Republican uprisings, he emigrated with his wife and 2 sons to the United States, and after a brief stint as a homeopathic doctor in Highland, Illinois, he was offered the editorship of Anzeiger des Westens in St. Louis. He had written for some New York papers, and his articles were translated, so he was kind of a well-known figure. The Anzeiger was at the time a moderate democratic publication, as was the entire population of about 25,000 Germans in St. Louis. But as the ideological battles concerning slavery intensified, Bornstein shifted his allegiance to the new anti-slavery Republican Party. There's a picture of him when he was editor and publisher. He was, in fact, influential in miraculously getting the Republican Party on the ballot in a mostly pro-Southern state. His name appears on the first statewide Republican ticket, as you can see here, which shows him running for the superintendent of schools. The name of a second notable immigrant Republican appears on the ticket as Arnold Krakel, and he was running for Attorney General. And you all must know Arnold Krakel from Jefferson City, right? So I don't have to say too much about it. Bornstein responded with great enthusiasm to President Lincoln's call for Union volunteers at a time when Missouri's secessionist governor, Claiborne Jackson, was secretly colluding with the Confederacy and pushing for Missouri to secede. While Jackson balked at the president's request, Bornstein took action by recruiting thousands of Missouri Germans through his newspaper. He, in fact, stepped down from his position as editor and listed himself and successfully led a volunteer regiment to occupy the pro-Confederate militia camp at Camp Jackson, which is located right where the SLU soccer field is on Grand and Lindell. It was out in the country, of course, at that time. He also had his troops remove weapons from the St. Louis arsenal, thus preventing the pro-Southern militia from making use of them. And here you have a fictional account or a rendering of the Count Jackson affair. It's fictional because the German volunteers, there was no time to get them uniforms. And so they wore these woolen gray tunics. One of the guys who, he gave me a duplicate of this to show in this exhibition, but they all just wore these gray, simple gray tunics. So this is definitely, you know, a fictional dramatization of the troops. So the Germans, oh, and this is when the Union volunteers are attacked by the mob. This is a famous picture of walking the pro-Southern militia members through the town, but they were, you know, attacked by a pro-Southern mob, most of whom lived around there. The Germans were proud of the central role they played at Camp Jackson, and the Anzeiger promoted the event's success by underscoring the immigrants' patriotic devotion. One article read, "Even the most bullheaded native cannot deny the fact that at the time of the president's first call for volunteers, the Germans of the United States were the best Americans, the most sincere Unionists, the truest patriots, and the men most ready for battle." As a reward for his services, President Lincoln offered Bornstein a plum position of American consul to Bremen. Bornstein accepted the job, and when he moved to Europe, he passed the newspaper on to his son. But Augustus was politically more radical than his father. Heinrich, the father, as well as the majority of Anzeiger's readers, favored gradual emancipation and remuneration to slaveholders. Augustus, on the other hand, supported immediate emancipation and publicly criticized what he believed to be Lincoln's hesitant policy regarding the issue. Shifting the tenor of the Anzeiger to reflect these ideals, the paper experienced a rapid decline in readership, and in 1863, Augustus sold it to join the United States colored troops. And here you have, I could never find a picture of Augustus, but I was able to find from the Missouri State Archives this enlistment, a colored volunteer enlistment of George Reynolds. And on the right side is an unidentified St. Louis soldier in 1863, a very famous image. Augustus served as a major in the 4th and 6th Regiments, fighting valiantly alongside his troops in the bloody battles of Chaffin's Farm and Newmarket Heights in Virginia. In his memoirs, Heinrich, this is a picture of Company E of the 4th United States Colored Troops Infantry. In his memoirs, Heinrich, has anybody read his memoirs, Diary of a Nobody? It's a fantastic read. It's like reading a modern novel, and there are actually 3 parts of it, but there's one part called An Austrian Radical During His Missouri Years. And it's, you know, he talks about coming over on the boat and all these things that happened to him, but it's a wonderful read. I would highly recommend it. It's a real page turner. So, in his memoirs, he mourns the manner in which his son rashly sold the paper to pursue a military career. Yet Augustus's courage and dedication to his troops is evident in a 4-page letter that he wrote from the front to his wounded superior, Colonel Samuel Duncan. In this letter, the young Bornstein conveys the great respect he had for his troops and profound sadness about the massive casualties in his company. "There are but few left of us," he wrote, "but they deserve the names of veterans, and I will fight hell and the rebels with them." He also describes the valiant actions of one soldier, Christian Abraham Fleetwood, whom he recommends for a Medal of Honor. And there was another one, Charles Veal. I couldn't find a picture of him. Fleetwood picked up the national colors. "We lost 200 men, but our honor is untarnished." Closing his letter with the emotional and dramatic flourish, "Yours until death," the young Bornstein conveys his passion for the ideals of freedom and equality. Augustus was one of many German Americans to be commissioned as officers for regiments in the United States colored troops. The well-organized German American community of Missouri supplied 43 USCT officers, second in numbers only to New York. The USCT proved to be a realm in which Germans and African Americans encountered one another and in some cases developed social bonds. Finally, I would like to close with a copy of Missouri's Ordinance of Emancipation, ratified January 11, 1865, 11 months before the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which emancipated all enslaved people in the United States. The convention at which the ordinance was drawn up was chaired by German immigrant lawyer Arnold Krekel, a radical Republican who, in addition to working for black suffrage, worked with former members of the 62nd United States Colored Infantry of Missouri to help found Lincoln Institute, the first African-American school dedicated to the education of the formerly enslaved. Krekel aggressively fundraised for the school and taught law and history at Lincoln for 10 years without pay. He served on the Board of Trustees for 22 years. And these are a couple of people. Logan Bennett, I think the last surviving veteran of the 62nd Colored Infantry. They all contributed as much money as they could afford for this founding of Lincoln. And here, members of the 65th USCT Infantry. The efforts of men such as Mühl, Straley, Münch, Bornstein, and Krekel, who fought for and dedicated their lives to advocating freedom and equality, has had a powerful and lasting influence on Missouri and the United States. While these honorable men were unable to erase the negative societal effects caused by racism born of slavery, they helped to create a more just and free society, one on which later generations have built and continue to build. Thank you.